Good evening and welcome to the first panel of a series called Dining and Design, Conversations with Chefs and Architects on Creating the Ideal Dining Experience. As I said, this is the first panel. We're going to have two more, one in May with Andrew Carmelini and one in June with David Chang. We're very excited about this series, that it's the fruit of a collaboration with the James Beard Foundation. We've had a very long relationship. I've worked with Mitchell and Susan Ungaro over there many, many times, and we're happy that this time we can have them here at the new school. So before I introduce Mitchell, who will moderate the panel, let me tell you a little bit about the Food Studies program here at the new school. It started in 2008, and now we have a pretty large set of classes that covered anything from culture to history to policy, politics, the environment. We're basically open to anybody who's interested in taking the classes. All the classes are open to the public, and this is really part of the mission of the new school, to keep this connection with the community. Recently, we've also started a partnership with the International Culinary Center so that our students can also get their diploma as chefs while working on their bachelor's degree. So we're trying to create, a new culinary professional, somebody who knows about food practically, but also knows about the social, cultural, political issues behind that. And I think this series is perfect in that spirit. We also often organize series of events. Last week we had a 2-day conference on food and immigrant life that went very well. So if you're interested in future events, please leave your name at the entrance and we'll make sure to send you invitations for what will come next. We also have a website called The Inquisitive Eater, inquisitiveeater.com. We accept submissions in fiction, nonfiction, poetry, design, photography, arts, and it's open to anybody. And we actually have had submissions from all over the world. These videos will be on the website as soon as we edit them. So the inquisitiveeater.com, and you can find also our past events. That said, I would like to introduce Mitchell Davis, who's the executive vice president of the James Beard Foundation. He's a cookbook author, a journalist, and a friend. And I'm very happy to introduce him, and he will moderate the panel and introduce the other speakers. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Fabio. Thank you, Fabio. And I also want to shout out to David Scobie, who's the Executive Dean of the New School for Public Engagement, for welcoming us here for this fun series of conversations, hopefully not the first of many. I'd also like to thank Susan Ungaro, our president of the Beard Foundation, who is here, and under whose leadership we have really made good on our mission, which has been the mission for 27 years now, to try to elevate food in some way into the realm of the other cultural arts. It may be funny to sit here in a conversation at the New School and talking about architecture and food to think that that's an unusual thing, but the reality is had we tried to put this panel together 20 years ago, there would have been fewer of you here, and there would have been perhaps even fewer interesting things to say. I also would like to shout out to some of our committee members. This series came out of the desire of our awards committee for the restaurant awards, led by Brooke Hodge, who's the chair of that committee, but also by Peter Guzy, who was on that committee, and James Bieber, who's an architect, also on the committee of the James Beard Foundation Restaurant Design Awards. And the idea was to rather than simply, which is not a simple thing to do, and perhaps we'll get into that, give out awards to the best designs for restaurants in America, no small task there, but to actually bring the design and food together in these sorts of conversations, because they go together so well. And by the end, we'll all be smarter about that process. But also because there is no undesigned restaurant, because food does not happen without a visual and spatial component. And so I thank you, Peter and James and Brooke, for your foresight in leading to this series of conversations. Also, one last bit of housekeeping is to point out that we will announce the winners this year of the Restaurant Design Awards, as well as some 70 other James Beard Awards on the weekend that begins May 3rd. It's coming up, so this is a very timely conversation. And it starts May 3rd with the Books, Broadcast, and Journalism Awards for the Beard Foundation. And Monday, May 6th, that weekend ends with the Gala Restaurant Chef and Design Awards at Lincoln Center. You can attend them. You can watch them live streamed at jamesbeard.org. You can follow the tweets live at Beard Foundation. And with that, to save us time, because we don't have a lot of it, probably the shortest commodity next to money in the building of a restaurant or any architectural project, I imagine, is time. You have the full bios of everybody here, so I won't spend too much introducing our panelists. I have another form of introduction, which will be to see some of the things that we're talking about, the design and the food. But I will say that next to me, as I mentioned, Peter Guzy is an architect partner in the firm As4 Guzy and founder. And this particular project we're talking about was nominated for a James Beard Design Award before you were on that committee, I presume. And that your projects span not just restaurants, obviously, but also commercial spaces, residential spaces, and all sorts of things that make our interaction with our physical environment more lovely and beautiful. To my left is Laureen Barber, whom, to correct some of the press that went out, is not Dan's wife, but his sister-in-law, just to point that out. And who is the director of design for the Stone Barns Educational Center and a co-owner and partner in the Blue Hill restaurants. So thank you for being here. And Dan Barber, who in our world needs no introduction, a two-time James Beard Award-winning chef, most recently for Outstanding Chef of the Year in all of the country, which was in 2009. The same year he was named one of the world's most influential people, not chefs, but people, also in 2009, and whose work just around the corner from here at Blue Hill and now also at Blue Hill at Stone Barns has been a platform not just for cuisine, but for a new way of thinking about food and feeding and the nourishment of our bodies and our planet that come from that. So really what you need to know these people is to see what they've done. And so we have a few slides that I just wanted to show you of the physical spaces and the design elements and the food that we're talking about, and that will encourage you to, if you can, head out and try to have these experiences. So the first couple are Blue Hill, which is around the corner. This restaurant opened when? Blue Hill? 2000. So 2000. So that's the dining room at the Rathskeller that is Blue Hill. And a project of a different scale, Stone Barns from the outside, from the courtyard, from the back, from the breezeway. What do you call that space?
The reception.
The reception. The reception. The dining room. We're now partly in your environment, getting closer to the table, on the table, where you might find food that looks like this, or this, or that, and you might even get that root at your table. That does happen there. It's not just for the photo. So I thought we'd hold it there so that we have a context for the conversation we're about to have. And we can go back to those slides if we need to here, or if you have any questions. And I know I said I wouldn't talk very much, but here I keep going on and on and on. When we first thought about this conversation, there are so many ways to think about the relationship between architecture and food. One of the most perhaps primitive is also one of the most enduring, and that is the great chef Antonin Carême, who was originally a pastry chef, is the one who first put pastry under the 5 arts that were painting, sculpture, poetry, music, and architecture. And he believed that pastry was the principal branch of architecture. So that's a very simplistic way to think of it. And if you were to ever see some of these 19th century creations, you would see that they were basically buildings of butter and lard and all sorts of things. But really, when we're talking about architecture in this context, we are thinking about an expression of an aesthetic, of a philosophy, of perhaps a taste, of some ideals in some senses. And in these particular projects, obviously, the collaboration between two creative people, creative in different media, in food and in environments or in buildings, or in design, or in objects, let's say. But that's an expression that has to, that is the result of a process, if it's good, let's presume. It could also, a bad result can be a result of a process also. And I thought I would just start with a quote that I found today in an interesting collection of essays called Eating Architecture, which is essays about the relationship of food and architecture. And this is by Professor Marco Frascari. And he says, and I want to use this as a way to start our conversation, architecture and gastronomy employ similar procedures of production. The process by which a hut built to house a holy image is refined into a temple is the same as that by which a boiled neck of mutton is refined into côtelette à l'impériale, or a grilled fowl is made into poulet à la Marengo. So this idea that there is food and there is cuisine and there is shelter and there is architecture, I think is a really nice place to start. And I'm just going to ask you, Peter, to comment on that and take us into this process of thinking about a restaurant.
Well, it's a great quote, and I think it's very germane to what this one. I'm sorry. I think it's very germane to what we in my firm and Dan and Laureen thought about when we first started to design, I guess, the first Blue Hill. You kind of start with nothing, and you need a point of reference. And the first thing that Dan did for us and Laureen is they took a space, an empty space on Washington Place, and they cooked a meal. It was an unconstructed room. I think we had demolished it at that point, and Dan cooked a meal. And the meal came out course by course. And as you take each plate of food, there's almost a DNA to be found in the way that the food is conceived, in the way that it's put on the plate, in the way that it's made. And for us as designers, this is very inspirational because we start to think about what it is that makes Dan's food special and what it is about the way it gets plated and the way it gets presented and the way it gets eaten. And that's a very exciting thing.
Mm-hmm. Dan, could you think about that change, the shift from food to cuisine and how it relates to a hovel to a restaurant or a temple, different type of temple?
Yeah, I was more thinking the opposite of a temple because when I sort of fell in love with the space, Blue Hill, New York, which is on Washington Place down the street, a few years before we ended up being there, many years before we ended up being there. I lived in the neighborhood, and I used to walk by it. And the owner, I used to go in actually for a drink after. I was a line cook at the time. I used to go in for a late night drink, and I don't know what it was. I didn't know what it was at the time about the space I liked so much, but it wasn't because I viewed it as a temple to possible gastronomy. It was like sort of the opposite, actually, of like I like the idea that it was on a street. How many of you heard of Washington Place? You know, it's one block. Nobody knows Washington Place. So I started to think that people would get a little lost getting there and that they would be hungrier. The food would taste better. That actually ended up being really true. So many people in 1999 were so lost getting to Greenwich Village, Washington Place, that they really did end up quite a bit hungrier than I think they would have been. I think anything tastes better when you're hungry. But I love I love that you go down a little stairway and you have to sort of bow your head. I never understood the Japanese tradition of those restaurants where you literally bow your head and enter into a space that's usually pretty cavernous. yeah, I don't know how to sum up restaurants today, but at the time, the trend was for very large temple-ish ceilings and cathedrals, for which chefs would show off, great cuisine, great gastronomy, and I like the idea of a place. I wasn't thinking about this from an economic point of view because it's a very small place. I was thinking about it more just like the psychological effect of coming into a restaurant where it had very low ceilings and where you had to bow your head sort of to get into the restaurant. And I like the idea that expectations were running quite low, and then that maybe if the cooking was right and the service was okay, we would meet those expectations or maybe even exceed them. And how many times in our life do we actually meet our expectations? Exceed them very, very rarely. And so, some of that was conscious, but a lot of it wasn't. I was really drawn to a place that had a humbleness and a feeling of low expectations, because I felt like it would make my food into something that was a lot more special than it was, and it worked on Peter. So,
but the spiritual moving that Dan received from the space, we didn't receive as architects, actually, because the space was, frankly, it moved Dan in a way, but it was a very miserable space. Frankly, it was like a shoebox, but a shoebox for flip-flops. It was less than 8 feet. It was 7'11" high, with one little window and one little door. And
I'll just interject and say that I think Lorene is brilliant. I really think Peter too is brilliant, and I'll say the first sign of that was when Peter came to one of the meetings and said he wanted to lower the ceiling. I thought that was brilliant.
Well, to create some expectation.
Well, yeah, that was a little Frank Lloyd Wright trick to make the other ceiling seem higher. So.
Well, can you explain that? Because I'm still not sure I understand that.
Well, when you go through a more compressed space.
I mean, this guy Frank Lloyd. What? No, I'm kidding. No, say what was it?
You go through a lower space, you feel bigger when you would get into a higher space. But the space was a great challenge. Yet, I think I shared Dan's instincts in terms of finding a way to transform it into a place for Dan's cooking. And I think that's one of the really fascinating things that we face as architects, working with great chefs and great people who help envision restaurants, is to find the relationship between the food, the sense of hospitality that they offer, and the architecture and a sense of place, where it is. Restaurants are in specific places. They're not ideas that get imported from here or there. This restaurant is on Washington Place. It's in a brownstone that's from the 1800s, and it's down 3 steps, and that means a lot. That means a lot. And then the discussions start. Okay, the brick's nice. How much do we keep? Well, we should keep this much or that much. We found a way to incorporate part of the brick so that there's still a sense of where we are, yet we transformed it into something different. So
I wanted to keep all the brick. I wanted to keep the urinals from the 50s, too. I love those. I should just say, Mitchell, sorry to take over that. I just want to say that I didn't find Peter, my life. It was really Laureen it was 100% Laureen who said, I've got a designer that I admire, that I've worked with, I think would be perfect for this space and for you. And so I was a really lucky thing that Laureen, because I had another designer in mind. I don't think I ever told you that, but I very strongly had another designer in mind. And she was the conduit of the whole thing and pushed it in a really
So, Lorene, what did you
way.
see that you thought would put these two together effectively? Or was it just...
I think that the work that, can you hear me? The work that Peter had done that I was familiar with was very sympathetic, like you said, to the place and to the space and to what I think the mission of whatever the work was. He was true to it, and I felt like that was really important to Daniel, that you definitely had a sense of nostalgia about this this, challenging rectangle that we had, and it was really in bad shape at the time. And I felt that not only did Peter have sort of the right sensibility and the right approach and the right professionalism, which were going to be important because we had never done anything like this. None of us had ever been in the restaurant business before. But that I felt like Dan had a very distinct point of view about the character of the place, that it was an old speakeasy, and there was lots of talk about being authentic and true to that original space. And Peter he just said, we haven't had this conversation in probably 14 years, and he's just mentioning it again. And I think that was the thing that I found most compelling about Peter and his work.
Do you remember what the first meal was that he cooked for you, or that you cooked for him?
It was delicious.
Gee, Peter.
I've had so
Sorry,
many meals by Dan.
I remember every course.
I do.
Do you?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it was?
Well, we were, I mean, it's funny, that was before the farm-to-table movement in many ways, and we weren't really a farm-to-table restaurant. Blue Hill, actually, Laureen named Blue Hill. I wanted to name it Half Acre. Actually, Acre. And Peter came up with the name of Half Acre. And
Lowering expectations even then, right?
And Lorene thought we were both idiots because Blue Hill is my family farm that I grew up on partly. And so, luckily for Lorene, not only was the introduction, but the name of the whole thing. And that helped solidify the theme. But at that point, we didn't have a name, from what I remember. I'm almost sure we didn't have a name. And so we were kind of all over. There's a very international cuisine.
It was dirty. I remember that.
The place was dirty.
It was filthy
I thought you were talking about my food. No.
And we didn't have lights.
Yeah, it was a little rough there.
Yeah.
Well, but it's interesting because the space was, and the telephone number is still some 539-1776.
Yeah.
So it had a kind of early Americana theme.
It had a George
And-
Washington theme.
Yeah, George Washington theme. So there were kind of kitschy lights hanging down from this very low ceiling.
I know there are a lot of design students, but I loved the kitschy stuff. I didn't think it was kitschy. I just thought it was right. It was 1776 was pretty smart, I thought. I mean, that's where I was at the time.
But I mean,
Not there anymore.
No, but it's interesting because it was almost a leftover from that early phase of American restaurant design.
That's right.
Which
Nice.
was European-based, where Italian restaurants had red and white checkered tablecloths, and there were steakhouses that, had mutton chops hanging from the ceiling, and then there were fancy restaurants that had pretense. When you walked in, you knew they were fancy, and you were going to get some French kind of food. And then Joe Baum happened, and the world changed. And first the Newarker, and then La Fonda del Sol, and then the Four Seasons, and then the Four Seasons, which is really the quintessential American restaurant, notable in that it's still with us
55 years later.
Thank you. 55 years later. And I think it's a really interesting thing because Joe Baum said with Restaurant Associates, restaurants have narratives. They have ideas. It's not just about an old model of a red and white tablecloth. It's about developing a concept. And the first concepts were based on different types of food. But then the Four Seasons was an American restaurant. And it celebrated American cuisine and the seasons, which is really a harbinger for where you come in a few years later. And it's beautiful because obviously the cuisine has changed in 55 years, the chefs have changed, yet the place, the architecture, the place where this happens, the temple, it stays the same. In fact, it stays unearly the same. And it's permitted the change to happen. And that's a really interesting thing that we think about when we do restaurants, when we design anything, is that you want to design something which is not good for 2 years or 5 years, and then you have to pull this out and change that. But to find the right essence of what Dan was all about, what his cooking was all about, because it's a fundamental thing. It goes deep to the root, deeper than that whatever that thing is. What was it over there? Dan? There you go.
That's a sugar beet.
Sure, deeper than the roots of the sugar beet, is what I was trying to say. And you know, if you make this space that fundamentally captures that essence and supports it in a way, then Dan can keep changing his food in a lot of different ways. And you know, and Dan is a chef and a fascinating guy and a philosopher in many ways. And many of you have probably read some of the things he's written. But when Dan talks about a carrot, and it's not just a carrot, but it's something more than a carrot. It's something exceptional, or foie gras and where it comes from. These, for us as designers, are actually food for inspiration. And we try to distill that same kind of thing into the design so that there's a relationship between it. And it's hard to define, and it's hard to say how it develops. And there's a lot of conversations, and it's not like it comes easily. It's something that evolves through thinking and eating and talking and exploring. But it's a fascinating thing why we're kind of here together talking today.
You just got, I just want to say, I want to give that in context and say that you just got goozed. And that's my expression for when Peter says something in a much larger context and gives you the historical and architectural and cultural context for design and living and life. And I've been goozed many times in my life. That was your first. I'd only say that the other day, I swear to God, it's like a setup for this thing. There's this young couple came to the bar the other night at Blue Hill, New York. They totally looked like they were about to be restaurant people, really nervous, really intense, looking at the napkins, looking at everything Laureen's brought to the table design. And so I just struck up a conversation with them. I don't know, I was on my way out. And they were like, yeah, we're really nervous. We're opening a restaurant. I was like, okay, who's designing? So yeah, we're working with this guy, Peter Guzy, and that's why we came here. And I was like, oh my God, yeah, he's brilliant. It's like, they wanted to say, I swear to God, they said, yeah, he's taken us to all these restaurants. We asked him to, give us his rundown. And then we have an expression for it. It's called goozing us. And they came up with that on their own. So there lives the gooze.
The gooze.
Everyone got goozed.
And there'll be specialists here to help you with that before you leave, so don't worry about that. Awesome. Well, let's take up this idea, Dan. How would you tell the narrative of your food besides cooking it? What are you trying to communicate with your food? You are a great communicator with words, but.
Well, so thank you, but I'm, the point of Blue Hill, and it didn't start this way, but it became much more about a connection to a farm at Stone Barns, a farm that's right outside your window, and in the beginning to Blue Hill Farm, which is the family farm. So the challenge was to create food that was sort of unplugged and not fussed over and natural in the sense that you felt like it was uninterrupted from the soil or from the pasture. And that's a little frou-frou, but it's really a lot of what we thought about. And so, my food tends not to be architectural, and I don't mean in the sort of Gotham bar and grill, tall food sort of era of restaurant cooking, but even today there's incredible chefs all over the world who are very connected to farms and to ecosystems, and they display this on the plate in ways that are just absolutely brilliant, and but tends to be like quite manipulative in the sense that there are a lot of hands and tweezers and stuff that makes the food beautiful. And I don't know that people would describe my food as especially beautiful to look at, which is why I'm very shy about the pictures, because we tend not to think that way. And although that's not because I scoff at other people who design beautiful plates of food, it's because it's not really our shiv here. It's not what we're going for, and we're actually going for something that actually looks a little bit much more organic on the plate, but not messy, but connects you with the agriculture behind it. And that's the best way I can describe it. And luckily I have Laureen who has this incredible sort of softness and way with creating the space at the table where instead of, you know, we're charging a lot for these plates of food, right? And it's quite hard. The pictures here, if you go back, I just, to give a, well, go back. Yeah, go forward, sorry. One more. Okay, so that, you know, that's a piece of bread, you know, and, you know, and a little marmalade of Swiss chard, you know. It's like, and ricotta cheese that we make to order, right? This is very simple stuff to have a course when you're paying $200 a person, and one of your courses is a piece of bread. I don't know, you know, it's tough.
You need a nice plate.
Right, well, yeah, luckily, you know, the plates, Lorene does, actually, you had a picture of the plate that Lorene designed for this course, because that picture was taken actually in Paris, but at another restaurant, but the plate that was designed for this, so she designed, you know, a plate that has wheat engraved in it, and actually the course is about wheat, because we're working with a wheat geneticist and a wheat breeder to breed whole wheat that is very delicious and sweet and nutritious. And so, you know, to communicate, I don't know, how the hell do you communicate that in a plate, right? But it is literally just a piece of bread. I think it's extraordinary because it's whole wheat, and so you know, I don't want to do anything else to it, but I have this plate to, like, you know, I don't know. It makes it elegant and at the same time doesn't distract from the theme.
So Dan was just talking about how he doesn't really take much care, how he puts the food on the plate, and he talks.
No, I didn't say that.
8 or 9.
I didn't say that. No,
8 or 9 minutes.
Strain of wheat.
No, I didn't say that.
Because in fact, the intent is, I think, precise and thought about carefully and intentful. The way the plates are merged with the food, the way the food is put on the plate, that's what means a lot to us as designers. That attitude is very legible. It's very,
See, but it doesn't work. Well, I mean, my point is it doesn't work if it was just me and you sitting at this table. I really don't think so. I think that's why Lorene plays such an important role, because and I know you wouldn't disagree with this, and it happened for a variety of reasons, but it you know, if we were, you know, Mission Chinese, or we were Mamafuku, and we were doing the kind of food we're doing, I wouldn't be saying this, but we're at the level, and I'm not saying I'm not making a boastful claim, I'm just saying in terms of what we charge, pure and simple, you know, there's an expectations for what a plate looks like. Mitchell knows this quite well, because he eats around the world, and so I'm very lucky to have someone as a partner who's looking at, you know, the gestalt of the table, not just the overall thing, but the gestalt table, which is that people feel elegant when they're eating this kind of food. It's hugely important. Otherwise, it would drive my cooking in a very different direction.
So
but that's a narrative.
That is a narrative, exactly.
That's a very specific narrative. It's a story that you're telling.
Let's hear your story, Lorene. How do you put that together on the table? What is the merging of the physical space and the food and that experience of the diner as you see it, and what's the narrative of that experience?
Well, I think Daniel sort of inspires all of us, and it's not just me. There's a group of us who are always in conversation with him about what it is he's doing. If it's working with a farmer on a new breed of wheat, how do we tell that story or that narrative? And you can't talk to people, you can't tell people too much at the table, but you can speak to them through the design of not only the fabric that you have on the table, but the plates that you have, and the pottery or the bone china. They all speak to the customer in a way that is unstated but yet very important. And what we try to do is be as consistent as the food is in terms of telling that story. And so the grain story was an easy one in that.
Sorry, my phone's going off. Sorry.
You know, that took a while. We were very intent on working with. I could talk to you about the plates because it's a great example of that. So he had it was a couple of years. He's having phone issues.
My phone's just speaking on its own.
It's anyway, it was a cuisine program that we wanted to support. And so we went to different artists, and we found one that we particularly liked. She's in Sharon, Connecticut, which is actually very close to Blue Hill Farm. And she was very enthusiastic about food and what we were doing. And we must have spent a year with her because she was so engaged in the process, trying to figure out how do we tell people about this intricate grain program, because so much of the food they're going to eat is related to that story without hitting them over the head with it. So we actually pressed 4 different varieties of wheat into the plates with her, and we created this pattern, and then she hand rolled each one and hand stamped each one. And so the customer actually gets this piece of china that they get their bread on, that has gone through that process that took years and lots of care, and people noticed it. It was interesting because we thought, are we going to go to all this trouble and nobody's really going to pay any attention? And they do. I feel like it's a fairly consistent thing that when you try to mirror what's happening in the kitchen in such a way with such care and similar quality to what's going on, people really do notice. And then that sort of drove us in this new direction of developing products for customers, because then they started talking to us about the things that they were seeing show up on the plate. So then we got more inspired, and we started talking to more artists. And this has been a new thing for us, and it's, to me, it's very exciting to have that. It's another way to express your creativity within the confines of a restaurant that is related to the food, but it's different. It's really a design. It's in the design area, and it's in product design. So, I mean, that's sort of a...
Thank you.
Okay.
So you go from the flip-flop box of a restaurant to a spectacular piece of property, a stunning building, something with a scale and a budget and a vision, a vision, all of those things. It had a scale, a budget, and a vision, let's just say that. What was that translation process like, both for you, from the food, from the design, from the architecture? Let's start with the architecture.
Start with the food. I'll start with the architecture, and just as an aside, I'll say, in addition to Laureen's work with all the plates and candles and cutlery and flowers and all those things, architects sometimes edit a little too much. Sometimes the way, we see Dan editing his food down to a pure conception, sometimes architects edit too much. And every time we did, Laureen reeled us back in. Kept us honest, kept us softer, made sure that there were considerations for a lot of things. And I say that because any creation of a place, of a restaurant, of a story, it's an evolutionary collaboration. There's a lot of back and forth, discussions, disagreements, arrivals at solutions, and that process is really fascinating, and the process can't be diminished in its importance. And at Stone Barns, we had a lot of challenges on our hands. These beautiful buildings done in a French Norman style by Atterbury in 1931 were so beautiful, and David Rockefeller said, let's keep its soul and make it new. Whew. And he walks out of the room, and that's it. And then and then we're set adrift, and it's a very hard thing because the buildings are so beautiful. The place is so beautiful. How do you make a place within these buildings? How do you make something that is of today in these buildings from 1931? I mean, the first reflex is to do something that is exactly like that old style. Well, that's not the right thing. You want to, and then I think back to Dan's food. It's traditional. It's modern. It's simple. It's complex. It has dualities. It has dichotomies that inform. So we tried to forge an aesthetic that was based on that somehow combined those things. That was comfortable yet rich, modest, fascinating, simple. All these kinds of things. Those are words. Making the space is actually harder. And to go all the way to the end, so many people, when they go there, they go inside, and they say, wow, this is great. Looks great. And they think that we just kind of dusted it off and put up some tables and made a restaurant. And that's a place, made a place. And that's actually very satisfying because we wanted the new restaurant inside of the stone barns to seem like it belonged inside of those buildings, to be completely compatible, to not be something different, but to not be a historical recreation of what you might find inside, but something of today that felt comfortable, that felt right. So when people have that reaction, my first impulse is to say, hey, we did a lot there. There was a lot going on. We changed everything. But then my second impulse is, well, that's good. That's a good response. And it's the same response people get when they bite into that one little carrot that Dan puts on the table.
Did that carrot change? I mean, obviously it has changed because cuisine evolves, but in the physical space, were you cooking to a different narrative in Stone Barns than in
now the
Blue Hill?
expectations were as tall as the ceiling.
Of course, right? Which is cathedral and temple-like.
Yeah, I hated it at the beginning because, and the expectations of the whole project was just, you know, it was impossible to serve a meal that anyone would feel excited about or feel like, you know, the 2 months of waiting to get in was, you know, was worthy of that. That's how I felt, and you know, I tend to be a little insecure about this stuff, but I still feel that way today.
Talk about the physical pieces, the objects. I mean, you obviously described this process of a plate, and so few people, I think, on Earth will have the opportunity to have that kind of creative idea articulated from the field to the table in a very literal and tangible sense. To fill up, did you have a similar notion of filling up this space in a modern way that felt timeless, or did you want to put pretty soft things all over these giant statuesque buildings?
Well, in fairness to the response of the pretty soft things, the first compliment I got on the space was when someone came up to my husband, who's not here tonight, but said, "So I understand your wife decorated this place." Yes, she did. Oh, these two women. Okay, so she's not finished yet, is she? When's she going to be finished? We were well open, and I was thrilled with the way it turned out. I think it has a certain amount of restraint that I'm comfortable with, and I think Peter would probably enjoy more restraint. So I wouldn't call it, if you haven't been there, it's not overdone.
No, it's not.
No.
Ungepatched, we might call it.
No. And we tried, you know, we had a theme as we were designing both architecturally and I think with the interiors, which was we wanted to, well, there were two. One was we wanted to sort of marry the inside and the outside. Like, what's special about being there? It's clearly that you're on this beautiful farm. And if you go into the room and you can't see outside, which was the case when we got the space, you couldn't see outside from the dining room because the windows were made for cows to look outside, and cows are taller than people are when they're sitting down. So that sort of started us on the road of really trying to make it a great place for people to dine, and to try to work with a space that was really meant for animals. So we had a long way to go, and the expectations were really high. And if you look, this is a good shot because from a design perspective, there are two, I think you would agree, Peter, that one of the most important, so we had the inside, outside, so we had the windows, which we had to change so you could look outside. But there was also this sense of we wanted to marry the old and the new. There was so much, these buildings were built in the 30s, and they were spectacular in and of themselves, but they had to be elevated to the point where they were going to be appropriate for a nice restaurant. And so Peter had this great idea, you can see the trusses in the ceiling there, of really just keeping them as they were, but minimizing them and bringing them back. There were probably 3-4 times as many trusses, the steel trusses going across. So those are the original steel trusses, but they weren't exposed. The ceilings were not much higher than they were at Blue Hill, New York when we went into this space. So we were...
For the cats.
for the cows. The cows didn't need high ceiling.
They needed to be
They
warm.
could see
They just needed
outside,
closets,
though.
good closets.
Yeah, they had a good view. But I think we were so worried and fighting against this notion that we didn't want to seem too fancy or too precious, and we didn't want to seem like a midtown restaurant. We wanted to seem like we were, which was all those things that Daniel just described. So in the end, we waited until the 11th hour, and it was a very democratic decision. We decided to blow the ceiling up and expose these trusses, which Peter reconstituted. And I think that that was the best decision we made, and we were all genuinely afraid to do it. And I really believe that it really sort of embodied all those old and new and inside and outside. It sort of is captured in the ceiling, which if you ever get a chance to see it, it's really spectacular. And then we kept the rest of it quite simple. And we have one piece of art, which is this piece of art, which was done by a guy named Ben McLaughlin. And I had to present this artist and his sketches to the head of MoMA's art department for approval. So talk about so it was a whole different process. We went from this, I don't know how many square feet we have in New York, but a little space with no expectations from anybody to
1,000.
1,000 square feet to a complex that's 40,000 square feet. We're not in 40,000 square feet, but a gigantic project that we were involved in the entire project. Wow. So anyway, it was a whole different process.
One thing I was wondering is the whole project of Stone Barns involves education and some, let's say, value development of sustainability. You mentioned impermanence, permanence, I should say, the idea that the restaurant lasts and isn't, a drop in the flash in the pan. But does the question of sustainability and some of these other missions of the place play into the design and into the food and what happens there? Not just the kids who run through and pet the animals and see how things grow in a greenhouse, but to the experience of the diner. Is there an education that happens subtly or overtly there?
I'll go first briefly, and then I'll let Dan address it more, because his story is I think a more penetrating one. But I mean, as designers, we try to use simple, honest, harvested materials. We reuse some wood flooring, we use stone, we use plaster, which is an ancient material, and we use bronze, we use metal. Those are the only materials that are actually in Stone Barns, pretty much. That's it, and some wood. That's all. So it's very kind of simple, but what Dan can speak to in terms of sustainability and food is a much richer diet.
Oh, really? Shit.
It's a setup.
Yeah, I was going to say, talk about low expectations. I was just going to say I just was so against everything that I was looking at. I was counting the things. I was against that picture. I was against blowing out the ceiling in the Democratic vote. I don't even think I was at the vote, but after the vote, I was against the thing that decided everything. The only thing I wanted was
majority vote.
Yeah, majority.
But we
You put together a good team. Let's say
at
that.
that point, we kind of knew what you wanted, despite yourself.
Yeah. So I'm sorry, I'm a little, how can I add to what Peter said?
Well, I just would like to know from the perspective of what you cook. Obviously, not everyone is coming to they're coming to Stone Barns for a beautiful dinner, a lavish, if understated experience, but wonderful food. And I wonder if you take the opportunity just in the cooking to insert in the narrative of the food some of the values about sustainability and about, obviously, ingredients you do, but that are the larger mission of the whole enterprise and that are your personal, or at least your public philosophy.
Yeah. So, well, but that's sort of the tension for me every day. It's how much of this, these issues. Luckily for us, for me, but for Blue Hill, is that this issue has hit the zeitgeist in the last 10 years. And I had nothing to do with that. We just caught this wave that just ended up, by chance, gripping everyone's imagination. This desire, this longing to know where your food's coming from. It's quite a simple idea, and you know, we evolved wanting to know where our food came from. We just got disassociated from it for a few years or a few decades, and especially in America. And so, you know, we hit this moment when people started writing about it and talking about it, and lucky for us, along came Mr. Rockefeller, who gave us the opportunity to talk about issues that we were already talking about, but do it in a platform that obviously we couldn't do in the middle of Midtown Manhattan. So, but your question is, you know, how do you, on a nightly basis, how do you bring these issues of farm sustainability, the ecological issues that are so complicated and mostly really depressing, and bring it into context of delight and pleasure through food. My only sort of saving grace, that a lot of that, you know, I tend to be the hit over the head guy, which is why I wanted to keep that George Washington painting at the old restaurant, because I just don't like this. I didn't like the subtleties until I worked really with Laureen and Peter. But what I like about, just to try and answer your question as directly as I can, is that it seems to me that food, we have an opportunity in restaurants to be, whereas restaurants have for so long been museums to food that's been tried and true and worked out for generations. You know, today restaurants can be these places of not just escape, but of real connection to larger issues that affect the outside world. And one of the great things about truly delicious food is that it breaks through the things that we can't see or the things that we can't perceive. They're ecological, they're connected. And the only way that we can, I think, understand them, or most clearly understand them, is through great flavor and through great experience, in the sense that you can connect to nature through eating good food. You really can't connect to nature through bad food. And that's a wonderful way to be in a business at this moment for me, because we do source food that is grown in the right way, and therefore, by definition, and I'm speaking a little bit reductively, but it's generally pretty delicious, and that generally doesn't require a ton of work on my part. And the extent that we can have this place to have people see where their food is growing and understand that connection, and be in a moment where everyone's talking about it, is really just a very fortuitous time to be me in this world. So I feel very lucky, and I'm not being falsely modest about my ability. I have a huge ego, and I think I'm a brilliant chef. But I feel very lucky to have designers who were able to bring this issue to the forefront without banging people over the head.
I think we should stop there and open it up to questions. Are there any? I presume there are some. Yeah. Susan?
Thank you. It's been really great listening to you talk about design in the restaurant, the visuals. Could you talk a little bit about your graphics, how you think about your logo as a brand, the
Great
print on
question,
paper?
Susan. Great.
So I guess I'll answer that. We, you know, there again, we wanted to sort of be true to the place and the fact that we were so lucky to have these buildings and the authenticity of the cooking. And I hate to use that word; it's so overused, but it seems applicable. And so I took a picture of the weather vane, you know, the crooked weather vane that was kind of falling down and hadn't been fixed yet before the renovation. And I thought, there's, you know, a hay barn, a cow barn, and a horse barn, and we got the cow barn, and we were certainly lucky to get it. And so we're gonna go with that. And I ended up commissioning an artist, talking about reductive, and the artist rendered it in hand, and that was important to me because I thought so much of what was happening at that time. Remember, that was 12 years ago. Was really the beginning of everything being done by computer. And at that time, I remember when I was in school, you had to draw everything before you were able to even turn on your computer. And so it was sort of that period of time, and I felt very committed to that being a hand-drawn logo. And then even, you know, some of the materials that we still use are old, and they're old engravings or they are actually drawn, and that's important. And so that's how we got the cow logo for Stone Barns. And really we tried to have everything have sort of a tactile quality and have a sense of you know, a real sense of texture to it in all of our materials. So we used cardboard. Even though it was a fancy restaurant, we had cardboard menus, but we had linen bookends. And so it was really, again, going with the theme of trying to marry the old and the new. We carried that through very consciously in the graphic design, and we had great support through designers and artists. So.
But the great thing is, when you start adding all these, when you accrue all these different things that we've been talking about, the graphics and the food and the architecture, and we haven't talked about uniforms, and we haven't talked about lighting, when you put all these things together, what you get is a rich and meaningful narrative that supports an idea. And that's why it's great to work with people like this, and that's why it's great to do projects which are not kind of one-liners, but that have a richness and a depth. And that's really and that's why the idea of permanence is so important, to create something that actually has those legs. It has, what kind of wine has long legs? I mean, you know, that has that kind of bandwidth.
Or is there a bit of a crapshoot? I mean, obviously you're all very talented people, and it's come together amazingly well. But is there a moment where you think, oh my God, we shouldn't have taken that ceiling down, or?
There is, but I think everyone kind of working together, questioning what's happening. You know, you when you build things, I mean, cooking is easy in a way, because if the chicken's not good, you change the recipe the next day. And with architecture, that's harder. You kind of have to get it right. It's not $20 for a piece of bread. It's $200,000 for a floor and a ceiling. And so we go to long lengths to try to get it right.
Right.
But we're more insecure than Dan is, and it is a crapshoot, and you just never know till it's done. If the lighting and the acoustics and the way things reflect off the plates and the flicker of the candle, you know, how that's all going to work together. But it's great to make these stories, and it's a whole universe. When you go in a restaurant, you go for 2 or 3 hours. You go to Stone Barns, you go for 4 or 5 hours. It's a longer experience, but it's a whole universe, from the time you call up to the person who greets you, to how you move through the space, how you walk down to the bathroom, what the mirror is like when your food arrives, when the check comes. It's a whole universe. It's like what's his name, Gabriel, 100 Years of Solitude. This kind of alternate universe that you inhabit for a little while, and it's such a fascinating thing, because you can control it all, and it all kind of grows from the food. The food's kind of the starting point, and all this other stuff is just kind of supporting roles that help with that narrative. But it's centered on the food. So fascinating.
Yes, question. Please wait for the microphone so we can record it.
Brilliant conversation. When does the design become old? When do you say, it's time to change this? This is so 2000. When does the food separate from the design that you created? And when do you make that decision to do a rehaul?
I'm going to say something before I let them answer, because you brought up the Four Seasons.
I can't answer that, because we already did our job. They decide when it's old.
I will tell you this story that the current owners of the Four Seasons told me, because I asked them how you could build. This place was so timeless. It seems you walk in and it is a moment in time there, and it just lingers, as Peter said. And he said, well, you should have been here 25 years ago when we were just old. And that in the course of those 54 and a half years, that has gone through, the perception of the design there has gone through a very different cultural experience. And so
that is a great question, because it's the same with graphic design as it is with interior design, I'm sure, with architecture, where you get tired of it way before your customers get tired of it. And it's the same notion of people wanting to change their logo because they're sick of looking at it, or their typeface. So I think you have to step back and really say to yourself, is there something that's truly tired or dated about it, or is it that I'm just looking for something fresh and new, and I want to follow a trend. So my best advice would be when you're feeling that impulse to ask other people, and that's why you have a good team and you rely on other people. And restaurants take a ton of maintenance. There's so much maintenance that goes into keeping them nice because you're dealing with the general public and hundreds of people there every day. And so it's easy to get tired of it. But I have to say, with both restaurants, I think because of what Peter said earlier, we went with simple materials, and they were really good materials, that I haven't tired of the materials. And I haven't tired graphically either, but you can adapt and change in little ways so that you don't change your entire look and feel, which I think keeping it fresh is good too. So.
Let me ask Dan a question, because
Please.
Dan,
Pretend I'm not here.
well, you didn't ask it, so I mean, Dan, it's your food, it's your conception. This is maybe a little self-congratulatory, but when you walk into your restaurants, does it feel like what you want it to feel like?
Dun, dun, dun.
He's still looking for George Washington.
He hired you a second time.
But I walk in the restaurants and I'm always feeling like, I got a big day and the thing, and I'm not really. It's more at the end of the night when I'm leaving, I think. I really think like that, the Stone Barns is I just give like a nod to Blue Hill, New York. I really think that's a very special space and timeless, maybe not in the way that the Four Seasons is, but we'll see. But I just feel like that's just one of the great spaces, and you don't find it in restaurants in New York anymore, for good reason, because of the size of it. It's just very hard to make money. But the way you both did that, I think it really is one of the great statements of understated and intelligent, thoughtful design. So yeah, I feel that way. With Stone Barns, I have different associations with, but I come in at the end of the night often to Blue Hill, New York. Almost every night I end up there. And I love the end of the night when people are leaving. And I feel like it's the restaurant that I always dreamed of, although I never pictured it.
I think we have time for one last question, if we have one last question.
Just back to the idea of what you're talking about, timelessness. I think one of the things with both the design and the graphics, and especially the food, is the whole issue of craft and the issue of handwork and of what goes into it and the expression of that. And I just wonder if, obviously it's clear with the food what that is, but how that related in terms of the design of the restaurant itself.
Well, I think that I spoke a little bit of how the logo was hand-drawn, and that was important to us, and all of the textures. If you look at the suite, which unfortunately we don't have a picture of, but if you looked at the suite of the stationery and the logo and all the items, there was lots of branding and three-dimensional qualities, and we sent out, when we opened, we sent our best customers seeds and a cake, and they came in a box, and we branded it, and we really tried to, from the very moment we started, to make an impression on people that there was a craftsmanship and a quality, and that the crafty quality, especially, that was important and going to be prominent when they came to the place. So you made that connection right up front. And even the shirts that the servers wore in the beginning were designed by our neighbor, which was John Varvatos at the time. And it was before he was super famous. And so then that became a ribbon that we had made, and it became the back of the business cards, and it became the back of the map, which was also hand-drawn. And all of those things take a lot more care and trouble, and we are a very, it's me and a part-time person, so it's a lot of work for a small staff, but I think that people noticed it, and I think that people appreciate when you take that type of care. And where I think we could do better is probably in the website, in sort of the world of the digital world, trying to imbue that quality of craftsmanship, even though we don't really market as much with paper anymore. I'm still sending out paper, but so anyway, that we don't have John Varvatos shirts anymore, but we still have his stripe.
So before we give a round of applause for the panelists in this fabulous conversation they've had, I just want to remind folks that May 20th will be here in this space, conversation with Andrew Carmelini and his design firm Roman & Williams, who've just opened the Hotter Than Hot Lafayette, not far from here.
This is like the rabbi's announcements before the last prayer.
Yeah. I'll ask you for money after. And then on June 10th, we have David Chang and his design team from the design agency, not for his restaurants here, which many of you may be familiar with, but with the spectacular 3-story cube of Momofuku in Toronto, Ontario. So they'll be with us on June 10th. I won't be in this space. It will be around the corner, and the details are on your list. So with that said, let's have a round of applause for Peter, Laureen, and Dan. Thank you for coming. Thank you for coming. Let's keep in our minds the importance and the impact of design on our food and food on our design. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan, Laureen, Mitchell, and Peter for this meeting. The video will be available on inquisitiveeater.com in case you want to listen to it. It was so rich of information. It might be really interesting, and you let people know that all these talks will be available on that website, and I hopefully see you on May 20th. Thank you for coming.
Well done. That's great. Thank you.